The emergency room at St. Alden's Medical Center pulsed with the frenetic rhythm of a Saturday night in coastal Port Verena, Oregon. Dim overhead lights flickered, casting jagged shadows across the linoleum floor where anxious families huddled, clutching worn-out insurance cards or staring blankly at their phones. The air carried a sharp tang of disinfectant, mingling with the faint aroma of stale coffee from a vending machine humming in the corner. Outside, the late autumn dusk draped the town in hues of slate and amber, the distant crash of waves against the cliffs barely audible through the hospital's thick walls. Mara Linden, 34, navigated the chaos with a calm born of a decade in emergency nursing. Her auburn hair was tied back in a loose braid, and her navy scrubs bore faint traces of iodine and sweat, marks of a shift spent in the trenches. She moved with purpose, her hazel eyes scanning patients with a precision honed by years of crises. Mara had grown up in a Coast Guard family, her mother a rescue swimmer who'd braved storms to save stranded sailors. That legacy fueled Mara's reverence for those who served and her unwavering commitment to their care. But lately, St. Alden's had become a battleground of bureaucracy. New corporate policies prioritized documentation over patients, demanding extensive intake forms and insurance checks before treatment could begin. Mara had already been reprimanded twice for bypassing these rules to treat critical cases, and one more infraction could cost her job. Each shift forced her to weigh her oath as a nurse against the hospital's rigid protocols, a conflict that gnawed at her conscience. At 11:52 p.m. Seebosch, the double doors of the ER swung open and a man staggered in, his flannel shirt drenched in blood, his face ashen. Daniel Kerrigan, 47, had crashed his pickup on Highway 101, slicing his forearm on jagged metal as he crawled from the wreckage. He'd driven himself to the hospital, each heartbeat pumping blood from a deep gash. "Please, help!" he rasped, swaying as he reached the triage desk, leaving a crimson trail on the floor. Mara's instinct surged. The wound screamed arterial bleed, pale skin, weak pulse, a ticking clock. She glanced at the desk clerk, Susan, who was already reaching for the intake tablet. "Mara, you know the rules," Susan said, her voice tight. "Intake first, no exceptions." Mara's jaw clenched. The pool of blood at Daniel's feet was spreading. "He's crashing, Susan. He needs a trauma bay now." Ignoring the clerk's protests, Mara supported Daniel's weight and guided him to Trauma Bay 2. "What's your name?" she asked, easing him onto the table. "Daniel. Kerrigan," he mumbled, wincing as she pressed sterile gauze against the wound. "Trauma team to Bay 2, stat," Mara called, her voice cutting through the ER's din. "Severe laceration, likely arterial, heavy blood loss." Dr. Elena Voss, the attending physician, arrived, her sharp eyes confirming Mara's assessment. "Good call," she said, prepping for immediate intervention. Susan stormed in, clipboard in hand. "Mara, this is a direct violation. Step away now." "Then write me up," Mara snapped, her hand steady on the gauze. "He's not dying on my watch." The team worked in sync, stabilizing Daniel with IV fluids and prepping him for surgery. Mara's focus never wavered, even as Susan's glare promised consequences. As Daniel was wheeled to the OR, he gripped Mara's hand. "You saved me," he whispered. She offered a tired smile. "Just get through this, okay?" Hours later, Mara sat in the office of Hospital Administrator Gregory Holt, her scrub still stained with Daniel's blood. Susan sat beside Holt, a stack of paperwork detailing Mara's infraction on the desk. "Ms. Linden," Holt began, his tone icy. "This is your third violation. Treating an unregistered patient without clearance is grounds for termination." Mara met his gaze. "That man was bleeding out. Your protocol would have killed him." "Rules exist for a reason," Holt countered. "Liability, billing, order." "And what about lives?" Mara shot back. "Isn't that why we're here?" Susan smirked, but Mara's resolve held firm. She'd chosen her patient over policy, and she'd do it again. The fluorescent lights of St. Alden's Medical Center buzzed faintly as the night shift dragged on in Port Verena. In the break room, the air was thick with the scent of burnt coffee and whispered outrage. Mara Linden's stand in Trauma Bay 2 had rippled through the nursing staff, igniting hushed conversations among her colleagues. Many had seen patients suffer under the hospital's rigid intake protocols. Heart attack victims delayed by paperwork, a child with a fractured skull waiting for insurance verification. Mara's defiance struck a chord. Nurse Lila Tran, a soft-spoken veteran of the ER, began collecting stories from co-workers, a diabetic patient who'd crashed after a delayed insulin dose, a stroke victim whose treatment was postponed for a clerical error. "Mara did what we all want to do," Lila told a cluster of nurses, her dark eyes fierce. "She put the patient first, and now they're punishing her for it." The whispers grew into a plan. Lila started an informal log of protocol-related delays, documenting cases where bureaucracy had endangered lives. The nurses agreed. If Mara faced termination, they'd fight back. Word of Mara's actions reached beyond the hospital walls when Daniel Kerrigan's daughter, Coast Guard Lieutenant Nora Kerrigan, returned from a deployment off the Alaskan coast. Nora learned how Mara had risked her career to save her father, a man who'd spent years as a volunteer firefighter after his military service. "This nurse is a hero," Nora told a local reporter from the Port Verena Beacon, her voice steady but emotional. "She saved my dad, and they're firing her for it." The story hit the presses, painting St. Albans as a cold machine that valued forms over lives. Social media amplified the outrage, with hashtags like #JustSaveNurseMara trending locally by morning. Dr. Elena Voss, who'd worked alongside Mara in the trauma bay, submitted a formal statement to the hospital board. "Nurse Linden's actions were clinically sound and life-saving," she wrote, her words sharp. "Punishing her undermines the very purpose of our work." The Oregon Nurses Coalition caught wind of the case, sending Representative Javier Ruiz to meet with administrators. "This isn't just about one nurse," Ruiz told the board. "When policies prioritize profit over patients, the system fails everyone." Meanwhile, Daniel Kerrigan recovered in his hospital room, his arm bandaged but his spirit unbroken. "Mara didn't hesitate," he told a Beacon journalist, his voice rough but firm. "She saw a man bleeding and acted. That's what heroes do." The story gained traction, picked up by national outlets, sparking debates about healthcare priorities. Nurses across the country shared their own tales of battling red tape, turning Mara's case into a rallying cry. But the hospital doubled down. At a tense press conference, Administrator Gregory Holt defended the termination. "We value our staff, but protocols ensure safety and accountability," he said, his suit crisp but his voice strained under the media's glare. The response was swift. Half the ER nurses called in sick the next day, forcing St. Albans to scramble for temporary staff. The hospital limped along, its reputation fraying. Mara, now jobless, stood outside the hospital, her braid loose and her eyes tired but resolute. The Oregon Nurses Coalition offered legal support, and a crowdfunding campaign raised $60,000 to help her fight. Job offers poured in from clinics in Seattle, Boise, and even a veterans hospital in Montana. "I don't regret it," Mara told a small crowd of supporters, the ocean wind tugging at her jacket. "I became a nurse to save lives, not to push paper. This fight's bigger than me. It's for every nurse forced to choose between rules and right." Then everything changed. Nora Kerrigan revealed her father's past to the press. Daniel wasn't just a firefighter, but a decorated Coast Guard veteran who'd saved lives during a 2004 tsunami rescue mission, earning a meritorious service medal. Mara hadn't known this when she treated him, but the revelation electrified the local veteran community. "We take care of our own," Nora said, her voice carrying the weight of her uniform. By dusk, a new wave of support was gathering, one that would soon flood St. Albans' lobby and shift the battle entirely. 6 hours after Mara Linden's termination, the lobby of St. Albans Medical Center in Port Verena transformed into a sea of navy blue and gold. Dozens of Coast Guard personnel, clad in crisp dress uniforms, poured through the double doors, their boots echoing on the linoleum. Leading them was Lieutenant Nora Kerrigan, her service ribbons gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The air, heavy with the scent of antiseptic and tension, seemed to still as hospital staff froze, their eyes wide. Media cameras already camped out from the growing scandal swiveled to capture the scene. "We're here to honor Nurse Mara Linden," Nora declared, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "She risked everything to save one of ours. That's courage. That's honor." The Coast Guard members stood at attention, a silent wall of solidarity for the nurse who'd saved Daniel Kerrigan, a decorated veteran whose tsunami rescue heroics were now local legend. Daniel himself, still pale from surgery, joined them, leaning on Nora's arm. "Your policy would have let me die," he said to the gathered reporters, his voice steady despite his bandaged arm. "Mara chose my life over your rules." The image of uniformed service members filling the lobby, with Daniel at their side, flashed across news feeds nationwide, turning Mara's story into a symbol of defiance against soulless bureaucracy. The hospital's administrator, Gregory Holt, watched from his office window, his tie loosened, his face tight with strain. The public backlash was relentless. Social media roared with support for Mara, and local veteran groups threatened to boycott St. Albans. The hospital's switchboard was flooded with calls, and several donors hinted at pulling funding. Down in the ER, the nursing staff's sick-out continued, leaving the hospital limping on skeleton crews. Mara, standing outside with supporters, felt the weight of the moment. Her auburn braid caught the coastal wind as she faced a growing crowd of nurses, veterans, and reporters. "This isn't about me," she said, her voice clear. "It's about every patient who deserves care, not delays." The tide turned when Congresswoman Lila Moreau, a former Coast Guard medic and member of the House Veterans Affairs Committee, arrived at St. Albans. Her presence, flanked by aides and cameras, elevated the story to a national stage. "Nurse Linden's actions embody the values we cherish," Moreau told the crowd, her gray hair catching the lobby's harsh light. "We must protect healthcare workers who put patients first." Her words, broadcast live, piled pressure on the hospital's board, who called an emergency meeting that evening. Inside the boardroom, Dr. Beatrice Salazar, a former Army surgeon and board chair, took charge. "Our protocols are strangling our staff," she said, her voice low but firm. "We're losing trust, patients, veterans, our own nurses." The board debated as protests swelled outside. Mara, meanwhile, prepared for a legal fight, working with the Oregon Nurses Coalition to document how St. Albans policies had endangered patients. She confided in Lila Tran, her friend and fellow nurse, about her doubts. "What if I've made things worse?" Mara asked, staring at the ocean from a hospital bench. "Patients are suffering because of this chaos," Lila shook her head. "You saved a life, Mara, and you've started a reckoning. Don't doubt that." The climax came when Holt and Dr. Salazar approached Mara in the lobby, now packed with supporters. Cameras rolled as Holt cleared his throat. "Ms. Linden, the board requests a private meeting." Mara stood tall, her scrub swapped for a simple sweater, her hazel eyes unwavering. "Anything you say can be said here," she replied, gesturing to the crowd. "Nurses, Coast Guard members, Daniel, and Nora. These people deserve to know your stance," Holt faltered, his prepared speech about protocol crumbling under the crowd's gaze. Daniel stepped forward. "Your rules nearly killed me," he said. "How do you defend that?" Dr. Salazar intervened, her military bearing commanding silence. "I apologize to Nurse Linden and Mr. Kerrigan," she said. "Mara's decision was right. Effective immediately, we're suspending the intake protocol and forming a task force to prioritize patient care." The crowd erupted, cheers mingling with the crash of distant waves. Mara felt relief flood her, but she seized the moment. "Thank you, Dr. Salazar," she said. "But we need guarantees. No nurse should face punishment for saving a life." Salazar nodded. "You have my word." The Coast Guard rendered a formal salute, and Daniel embraced Mara, tears in his eyes. St. Albans reinstated Mara as chief nursing officer, and her case sparked reforms nationwide. The Linden Protocol became a model for balancing care and administration, boosting morale and patient outcomes at St. Albans. 5 years later, Mara, now a national advocate, stood in the renamed Daniel Kerrigan Trauma Center, watching her team save lives without fear. Sometimes, she thought, the greatest act of care is breaking a rule to save a soul.